All right, everyone, welcome back. So we're going to get into our next topic, World War One. And of all the lectures I give, I oftentimes say World War One might be the most significant topic I cover, and even more than World War Two in some ways. And you say, how is that possible? Well, World War Two doesn't happen without World War One. And so there's a lot of material we're going to talk about in this series of lectures on the war. And obviously, we're going to start by looking at the causes of the war and why the war happened. And there's a lot of resources out there beyond, obviously my lectures, there's things you want to take notes on and learn from for my class. But, sometimes I like to recommend other things before I even get into any of this stuff. There's a great book that I read called The Sleepwalkers, and that's an excellent book that gets into the real weeds of the war. I'm going to give you some pretty good detail on why this war started, but this book really, The Sleepwalkers, really gets into tremendous detail, even more so than I'm going to give you in these lectures. So that's one. Movies, 1917, that's a good movie that really shows you what it was like in the trench warfare. Great documentary called They Shall Not Grow Old. That's an excellent one that they took World War One footage and they colorized it. And when I first saw it, I was like in awe how good it looked and how well done it was. Very powerful stuff. And then, even movies. I recently saw the Kingsman movies, and I don't know if you've seen any of those, but the most recent one, the third one in that series, I believe, was all set during World War One. And whoever did the research on that movie really did a lot of good research. Obviously, it's a Hollywood movie, very violent and all that. If that's not your thing, just so you know, but they add all these crazy plot stories to it that are of course ridiculous. But there are names and people and events that are very subtle and a lot of people don't know about, but are all part of World War One. And so I swear, if you watch my lectures on all of World War One and go watch that Kingsman movie, you'll go, "Oh wow, I saw that in there and that in there." Even to the point where there was an image, an art image of a battle scene in the movie, a fight scene in the movie that was taken right out of, I swear, an artist that was doing artwork for World War One. And so you kind of see all these little nuance ideas in there. So there's a lot of fun ways to study about the war. So, anyways, in terms of the war itself, obviously we're going to talk about the causes. I'm going to focus on causes that we've covered in some previous lectures, but really focus on some new ones and called entangled alliances, which get very complicated. That's the other thing about this World War One lecture. It's really important, but also can get really complicated as well. And you'll see what I mean by that as we go through some of these entangled alliances. But you know me, I walk you through very step by step, and it should be pretty clear. But this is definitely one of those lectures you may want to go back and listen to and double take the notes on to make sure you get them all straight. Then, of course, we're going to talk about the war itself. And when we talk about the war itself, that's when we get into the trench warfare. And for me, it's not enough just to have students know the details, right? I want you to know the feelings, the emotions that this war created, because that plays such an important role to the next part, which is understanding the impacts of the war. Because for me, understanding World War One is all about impacts, 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 right? What impacts did the war happen during the war? What were the impacts of World War One right after the war? And what were the impacts even a generation later? So there's a lot of material we're going to cover over these series of lectures on the war. So it's going to be a pretty important topic. And even after we're done with all the World War One lectures, I'm going to still be referring to World War One as we get into other topics, the interwar years and eventually World War Two. So there's a lot of key information you're going to need to get out of this lectures. So here we're going to just kind of start with some of the causes. And so let's get going here. And so some of the causes are things I've kind of covered from previous lectures, but I definitely want you to know about. So nationalism, this is going to come up again as we move forward. But one of the definitions I kind of gave you of nationalism is this idea of the state of mind rising out of an awareness of being part of a community that has common language, cultures, traditions, and customs. And we covered that in more detail in, I believe, a previous lecture. But it's going to definitely help you understand why World War One happened. So definitely you want to know that. Another important cause of the war is this concept of entangled alliance. This concept of the unification of Germany. And so when you look at Germany, obviously here's Germany. We'll just circle it over here real quick. Germany is united in the 1800s. World War One is going to happen in early 1900s, 1914. And so how is that connected? Well, remember, it's part of the unification of Germany This territory of Alsace-Lorraine I talked about, which was part of France, and then the French lost it in the Franco-Prussian War, that's going to upset France, and that's going to create tension between France and Germany. And even though it happened a generation or so earlier, it's going to, create that tension between these two nations, and you can easily see how that's going to help, help bring these two nations along with several other countries in Europe into war. So again, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on that because we covered that in the previous lectures. Colonization, again, something I've covered in a previous lecture, but as these European powers are colonizing Africa and colonizing Asia, it's like a grab bag and everybody wants to be the top dog. And, it also creates another interesting idea of these colonization. It creates like bargaining chips for these nations. I'll let you have this influence in this area if you let me have influence over that country, and we'll be friends, and we'll go against another country. And so it all kind of sets up for the big topic I want to eventually talk about today, which is entangled alliances. So this colonization, that creates tension between nations and gives them things to fight about as well, these European nations. And then another cause that actually I don't think I've gotten into before, but you could easily see how it might create some tension between European powers, is the growing arms race that we see in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And just to give you a couple of details you can jot down, it's often said between about 1890 and 1914, before the war begins, the military machine of Europe doubles. So, twice as many men and twice as many weapons and twice as many vehicles and all of those things that we start to see. We'll see Russia, going to have an army of over 1 million men. And you think of the Napoleonic army with like 600,000 men. And so we're going to start to see massive amount of troops in various nations. They recruit more men. And of course, as the war starts, it's going to, have drafts, and it's going to even be bigger. But even before the war, as all these sides are building up their weapons, everybody's trying to create some tension as well. So these are some things we've kind of covered in previous lectures. So again, nationalism, unification of Germany, colonization, arms race. But I want to get into this lecture things we haven't covered yet, and specifically this concept of entangled alliances. And so this is where things are going to get a little tricky. You got to follow carefully, but I think if you do, you'll get a sense of everything that's happening here. So let's go on to our next slide and start talking about the series of entangled alliances. A lot of people, when they lecture this, just kind of start, the 1914 period. I want to backtrack a bit because you have to have a little bit more background to fully understand these alliances. So there's a set of alliances in your modules. Actually, I have a sheet that's a flow chart for you of all of this. So all of my students, if you're taking my class, you could just obviously look at that flow chart. It's in your module, and it should help you out with understanding entangled alliances. But the first set of alliances I want you to know is what we call the Three Emperors League in 1873. So again, this is years before World War I breaks out. And the Three Emperors League consisted of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Russia. And again, I'll show you a bigger map here in a second where all these nations are. So, and again, you should already seen these from my previous lectures. But Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Russia. And what happens is this alliance actually does not hold, right? This alliance is going to fall apart. We call it the Three Emperors League because it involved three emperors. And the reason it's not going to fall apart is a couple of factors. One is going to be Russia and Germany. And Russia and Germany are actually going to come to pretty fierce disagreements in 1878 because of what is called the Congress of Berlin. And here we have a very important man, Bismarck. I've mentioned Bismarck before in my other lecture as well when we talked about the unification of Germany. And so Bismarck, if you remember him, he is a big player in this Congress of Berlin in 1878. And one of the issues in the Congress of Berlin is the concept of Bulgaria. So you see all this area here that's colored on this map? Again, this is a close-up of Bulgaria. And what happens in the Congress of Berlin, kind of simplify this, is the region of Bulgaria is broken down into smaller bits and pieces. Now, who would this upset? Well, it actually upsets Russia because Russia loses a lot of their influence in the region as a result of this. Russia blames Germany for this. And so Russia, as a result of the Congress of Berlin, feels that Germany's kind of taken away their influence in this region of Bulgaria, taken away their ability to control. And at the end of the day, that's what this is for a lot of these European nations. They want to be the most controlling powers in Europe. And so this takes that away from Russia. So this puts Russia and Germany in a bit of tension, right? So kind of keep that point in mind. So that's the big thing I want you to know about the Congress of Berlin, that it shrinks Bulgaria, divides Bulgaria, and more importantly, creates tension between Russia and Germany. Meanwhile, you also have the area of the Balkans, which we're going to talk more about later, but the Balkans is this region just kind of north of Greece and Macedonia and that area there. And that's another region where Austria-Hungary is going to have a conflict with the people in that area as well. So there in the Balkans, you have Austria-Hungary, right? They want influence there, but so does Russia. And so you're going to have influence conflicts between Austria-Hungary and Russia. So at the end of the day, this whole first league, these three emperors league, is not going to hold very well. And we're going to see Russia and Austria-Hungary and Germany, especially Russia with both Austria-Hungary and Germany, not get along too well. And eventually this three emperors league falls apart. What happens after that? Well, a new set of alliances is going to emerge. So here, Germany's going to try again. This time they're going to form an alliance with Italy. Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy are going to form this alliance together around 1880, I think it was 1882, and they said, we'll all help each other, right? If we can't, work with Russia, we'll do this. Well, that actually holds for a while. Eventually, it's going to get to the point where France and Italy start talking, and Italy takes more of a neutral position before the war starts. But what's really interesting is as the war is about to begin, actually as the war starts, when the war begins, then you get an interesting development where there's this agreement between England and France to basically pull Italy out. And so this kind of is jumping ahead a bit, more jumping ahead than actual causes, but it's just interesting. There are these regions called Trieste and Trentino in the northern part of Italy. And so in these areas of Trieste and Trentino, in the northern part of Italy, Italy wanted those territories, and Austria had influence over those territories. So there was basically the secret agreement between France and England. Hey, you get out of to Italy. Hey, Italy, you don't support Germany and Austria, and we'll help you with some of this piece of real estate. So that's kind of an interesting point as well that develops during this time period. Eventually, Italy pulls out, but Germany will have another ally. And so kind of the big ally Germany will have will be one with the Ottoman Empire, which I'm going to explain here in the next slide. Look, and this is the final set of alliance you're going to get for Germany before the war breaks out. It's what we call the Central Powers, and this is one that I definitely want you to know. So you have the Central Powers, and you have Germany, Austria-Hungary, and of all things, the Ottoman Empire. In my History of the Middle East class, in that lecture, I actually go into detail of why the Ottoman Empire joins with Germany and Austria-Hungary. And again, just to show you these other areas that I was talking about before, this whole region over here, roughly, that's kind of the Balkan area, right? Here's again Italy over here. And so Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire, they form this alliance that's going to become known as the Central Powers. We call them the Central Powers because they run down the central part of Europe. So that's going to be one of the set alliances as World War I finally breaks out. So you kind of want to understand that, yes, there were other attempts, whether it was the Three Emperors League or this attempt to bring Italy in. But at the end of the day, the Central Powers are what we're going to call it when this whole war breaks. Now, as all this happens, obviously other countries in Europe are like, well, wait a second, if these guys are forming an alliance, don't we need to form an alliance as well? And the answer to that is, of course, yes. So then we get this other set of alliance I want you to know, and that's called the Triple Entente. And that included England, France, and Russia. And so here you're going to get England and France, which are logical. Why would England and France join? They share very similar. Well, actually, if you stop and you think about it, they hated each other for much of history. But by this point, they share a lot of common beliefs and ideas. They both see Germany as a potential threat. Why Russia? Well, England doesn't have that much in common with Russia, but again, both of them see Germany as a possible threat to them. There was also interesting, and in that book, The Sleepwalkers, I mentioned, it gets into some real nuance on this, but there was this kind of ideas of, England was in India and they didn't want Russia to bother them in India. So if they're friends with Russia, then Russia will leave India alone. And that kind of you don't need to know for my courses, but just those nuances get so crazy when you start to think about it. So at the end of the day, we get the Triple Entente, and that's going to be England, France, and Russia. So that's another set of alliance we have. Now we're not done, because other than those two big alliance systems, there were small alliances as well you need to know. And one of the small alliances I want you to know is what we call the Slavic Alliance. And what is the Slavic Alliance? Well, it's pretty simple. It's just Russia and Serbia. So here's Russia, and here is Serbia. And I call it the Slavic Alliance because the people in Serbia, a lot of them, not all of them, Serbia is very mixed, has a lot of Slavic people in them. And these Slavic people migrated from Russia centuries earlier. So in some ways, kind of Russia sees Serbia as their little sister. And that's going to be an alliance as well. And interestingly, it's going to be this alliance that's going to help trigger the war. Because by 1914, as you have these different alliances, and you have all the other tensions, as I mentioned before, from the previous alliances, from the Franco-Prussian War, from the colonization, all these things are going to eventually come together. And then in 1914, a young boy, and I say the word boy because he's like 18, 19 years old when all this happens, is going to trigger World War I with, of course, these alliance systems being a major role. So who is this young boy that triggers World War I, and how does this all eventually lead to one of the most unexpectedly horrible wars in history for their perspective? That's what we're going to cover in our continuing lecture, in our next one. All right, so I hope all that's clear. Let me know if you have any questions. Thank you, everyone.